in terms of curriculum at the time. Don't spend the rest of your life justifying why you did it. Just let it go. That was the best I knew to do then. Now I'm going to do something different. But you see people who just over and over again, because they did something, they started doing it back in the 80s, they want to keep saying why they should be doing it now. And it just doesn't make any sense, Just like be strong enough in character to say, things move, times change. Consider what values you are teaching, and consider whether you are teaching skills and concepts in authentic contexts. And that's a really important idea that will show up, you'll see, during this lecture. But then you might say, but Olivia, what about local, state, and national standards? We're teachers. We can't just make up what we're going to teach. Well, I want to say something about that. Standards were developed by people, by sincere people reflecting their best understanding of the arts and culture at that time. Times change. It is our job as contemporary artist educators to teach the most useful, complex, artistically sophisticated version of art education that we can now imagine. Art education will change from the bottom up, not from the top down. When people go to the state capitol or some sort of meeting and they start working on state standards, those are people, those are teachers, those are professors. They go together and they talk about it. But they're not going to talk about a totally new paradigm in the standards. The standards are going to reflect what the most innovative teachers are already doing. So that's like your job, right? Now, let's take a look at the National Visual Arts Standards. Now, one of the things that I kind of noticed a few years ago is that you started looking at standards. I would look at the standards in different states when I went to visit, and I looked at the National Visual Arts Standards, and I started to notice that the way standards are organized, very often, like the very first standard is about vocabulary, or then it's about media, and sometimes they're like vocabulary, then media. But it's like vocabulary and media, and then, there's all these other things. Then eventually, as you get down lower, you get to the idea of what are the uses of art. Let's talk about art in the context of culture. But that's always like lower in the list. But the funny thing about that is, one thing that's really important to remember, standards were never meant to be the framework of a curriculum. It would be like designing a house and making a checklist and saying we need 3 bathrooms, we need a kitchen, we need this and that, as opposed to designing a house and saying, well, what's our family like? What kind of space do we want? What kind of flow, right? And so standards are just a checklist. So you don't use a checklist to design your curriculum. The other thing I started to realize is, what if we had organized the standards differently? What if just at one of those meetings, all those countless meetings that happened where people were writing standards, they had just done this. They had taken that standard about culture and put that at the top, understanding the visual arts in relation to history and culture. And if that was the framework, and then we thought about doing these other things about media and vocabulary under this bigger umbrella. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. It does not make sense to say, okay, I'm going to teach this vocabulary about, line and form, and then I'm going to put into that line and form exercise, I'm going to show them some cultures that use line in their art. And that's how I'm going to teach multiculturalism. It doesn't make sense, but you know what? You can see that illustrated in textbooks all over this country. So what if we said, first of all, let's talk about history and culture. Then let's think about choosing and evaluating a range of subject matter. Like, why would we choose to make what we make? And then we start thinking about media and techniques and processes. So you see, the idea is that what we're thinking about is, what if you just rearrange the standards? It's kind of like all those history classes we took in high school where we never got past World War II, So, let's think about that. And I would actually even change this a little bit. Like, why are we so obsessed with evaluating and assessing all the time? Why can't we just talk to kids about making meaning and teaching them things because the kids intrinsically think that that is meaningful? Now, I understand that there's times and ways in which you have to do assessment, but I do think that the field of art education and field of education in general are overly concerned with assessment nowadays. It's just true. And we have to be, we have to be able to stand up and say, it's not like we're afraid of figuring out what we want to do, but it's just like, it really is an over-concern. And that's a very particular cultural choice. And I don't think it's a cultural choice that we want to keep making. Okay, so An unfortunate consequence of structuring art curriculum on academic techniques and decontextualized formalist vocabulary is that students learn incorrect ideas about how meaning is generated. Instead of seeing meaning as the result of the play of signifiers in cultural contexts, students tend to learn that there is a simple and direct, not culturally determined correspondence between form and meaning. Now, there's a lot packed into that sentence, and I think it's a really important sentence, and I think it's really, really quite true. That one of the things that happens is that if you're in a situation where it's just like, okay, what color is going to express passion? Oh, red. You know, and then people start to think that there's like this one-to-one connection. But actually, the way things mean is by putting together a number of signifiers, a number of tropes, a number of symbolic ideas, and then you put those into play. And it's not a one-to-one symbolic relationship that everybody knows. It has to do with what that color means in the context of other colors in this painting, right? But a lot of times kids, because of this kind of curriculum, get this idea that meaning is just a one-to-one relationship with form. And it's a real problem because it means that the kids do not learn to be sophisticated about thinking about how meaning is made, not just in visual art, but in literature and in history, reading history, and in all sorts of things, in looking at films. And so this is a really important central idea to being an educated person that gets misrepresented when we tie ourselves constantly back to this formalist curriculum. Contemporary theories of meaning-making recognize that all meaning-making involves borrowing from previous meaning-making. In other words, you couldn't understand me unless I was referencing words that you've already heard, that you already understand in other contexts. When I make a joke, you wouldn't laugh except for the fact that you have references to that information. So that all of that, idea about communicating, whether it's visually or verbally, is all a form of borrowing, because that's how language works. So how can we introduce students to sophisticated contemporary concepts of constructing and deconstructing meaning? We must invent new school art styles. And I'm using this word school art style. There's a very famous article that was written back in the 70s by Arthur Eflin. And I'll just read a couple of quotes, because the worst thing I hate is when there's different words on the screen from what the person's saying, because then it gets like really confusing, to me at least. One of the functions of the school art style is to provide behaviors and products that have the look of humanistic learning. As long as the art program seems to be producing products that have a free and creative look, school persons can say that the school is not just a cognitive matter. The self-same creative activities may not be as free as they look. So what this was is that Arthur Eflin looked at all this stuff that was going on in schools, and he said, oh yeah, supposedly this is supposed to be this big, creative time for the kids. But then when you see art teachers who do these kind of cookie-cutter projects where every project looks the same, then the idea is, wait a minute, that's really not creative because everyone looks the same. And so it's just supposed to kind of look creative. And the kids, in a sense, are performing, like he was sort of saying, the kids are being asked to perform kind of a fake creativity so that they, in a sense, validate the fact that it's okay that the rest of school is really boring, or the rest of the school is pretty rigid, And I'm a big fan of all education, but the idea is, again, can we imagine in some ideal society of the future that kids are just going to spend learning time sitting in straight little rows, I mean, we can, as utopian imaginers, there must be some other way that kids could learn things, right? So we want to think about that. But so Eflin talks about the idea that maybe a whole lot of art curriculum is not really as creative as it should be, but it just gives this look of creativity. And I've talked to Arthur Eflin about this a lot when I was first writing this lecture, and I said, but Arthur, I mean, you say this, but I'm going to just skip this one here. What are we supposed to teach? You made this critique that everybody was just like, oh my gosh, you're so right. What are we supposed to teach? And Arthur said, yeah, and Arthur's like 80-something now. He said like, yeah, a lot of people said that to me. It's just like, but see, I realized I'm this very practical person, right? So I'm thinking about teaching. And Arthur really is. He's a brilliant scholar. I totally recommend that you read, things that he's writing nowadays about art education and aesthetics and stuff. But, but in a sense, what he did was he critiqued the practices of education, but he didn't really talk about, well, how are teachers supposed to invent some other way of teaching? And the problem is, and I really think, that it suggests that this fantasy of utterly authentic individual curriculum. But we all know, if you've ever taught, that that is not, even in a college you can't do that. You have to teach the kids something.